Hey, Greg,
Yes, Dr. Mole.
do you want to know why ukuleles break down so frequently?
Why?
Because they're very high-strung. In today's episode, we're going to define a production possibilities frontier and use this frontier to understand how relative prices are computed. So, we introduced the key ideas that make trade worthwhile. Time is fixed, and people have different skills, which leads to people maintaining different prices for different activities, and this leads to trading opportunities. Let's explore these ideas in detail. Imagine an island with just two people on it. Call them Dean and Randy. And on this island, there are only two activities: brewing beer and making cheese. Now let's say Dean can brew 5 kegs of beer per hour, and he can make 4 wedges of cheese per hour. But Randy is a bit more skilled than Dean at both activities. He can brew 10 kegs of beer an hour, and can make 9 wedges of cheese an hour. You might ask, why would Randy bother trading with Dean? He is obviously more efficient at brewing beer, and is better at making cheese as well. The answer is that Randy and Dean have limits on their time. For this reason, they will assign different values to these activities. Let's examine how this works. We can trace through what Randy's output of cheese and beer would look like under different allocations of time with a simple table. Suppose Randy can only work 8 hours a day. If he splits the day evenly, he can spend 4 hours making beer and 4 hours making cheese. This would allow him to brew 40 kegs of beer and to make 36 wedges of cheese, all for his own personal consumption. If Randy wants to brew 50 kegs of beer instead, he must spend 5 hours brewing. But now, he has only 3 hours in which to make cheese, and he only produces 27 wedges of cheese in those 3 hours, 9 fewer than before. You can also look at the output if he spends 6 hours on beer and 2 hours on cheese, and so on. This table is referred to as a production possibilities frontier because it describes the limits of Randy's production when he has only a fixed amount of time for brewing beer and making cheese. Notice that because his production time is fixed, Randy faces a trade-off. If he wants to have more beer, he'll have to have less cheese. This is why economists describe this table as a frontier. If Randy cannot work more than 8 hours in a day, then he can't possibly produce more than 40 kegs of beer a day for his personal consumption if he also wants to have 36 wedges of cheese. Although, if he were literally consuming 40 kegs a day, the point would probably be moot. He'd likely be dead. Or from Wisconsin. But for simplicity, let's just call what he does as consuming. The point is, the table represents the outer limits of what Randy can produce for his own consumption, depending on how he allocates his time between brewing beer and making cheese. The fact that Randy's work time is fixed, which leads to the creation of a production possibilities frontier, means that Randy faces trade-offs. If he spends just enough time to brew 1 more keg of beer, he would have to reduce his time making cheese such that 1 extra keg costs Randy 9/10 of a wedge of cheese. Alternatively, if Randy wants to make 9 more wedges of cheese, he must brew 10 less kegs of beer. Thus, 1 more wedge of cheese costs Randy 1 11/100 kegs of beer. Notice that I've slipped in the word cost. That was on purpose. Although the production possibilities frontier describes only how quantities of beer and cheese vary with time, based on the data in this table, we can determine the implied cost or price of cheese in units of beer, as well as the price of beer in units of cheese. Time out. Notice, I didn't talk about the price of beer or cheese in dollars. I spoke of the price of cheese in kegs of beer and the price of beer in wedges of cheese. You might think this is odd, since in the so-called real world, we quote prices in dollars, not in units of cheese or beer. Do we need to quote prices in dollars? Prices in dollars? Prices in dollars? Prices in dollars?
In dollars?
Prices in dollars?
Prices in dollars? In dollars?
Why don't we quote prices in quarters or dimes? Or for that matter, do we even need currency for prices to exist? $1 is an arbitrary reference point. Suppose a set of guitar strings costs $5. We could just as well have said that the strings cost 20 quarters. Or if a guitar pick costs $1, we could have said the set of strings costs 5 guitar picks. Prices represent trade-offs. They tell us exactly how much of one good or service we have to forgo to acquire another good or service. Thus, when we say that one wedge of cheese costs Randy 1 11/100ths of a keg of beer, and that one keg of beer costs Randy 0.9 wedges of cheese, we are ultimately talking about the price that Randy pays for his beer and his cheese. And those prices are dictated to him by his production possibilities frontier. Now let's return to Dean. Because his time is fixed at 8 hours of work a day, he also has a production possibilities frontier, and it looks like this. Suppose that, like Randy, Dean spends 4 hours brewing beer and 4 hours making cheese, such that he produces 20 kegs of beer and 16 wedges of cheese for his own personal consumption. If Dean wants to have 25 kegs of beer, which would require 5 hours of brewing time, his output of cheese must fall to 12 wedges, because he's only left with 3 hours to make cheese. So, for Dean, 5 extra kegs of beer costs him 4 wedges of cheese, meaning 1 extra keg costs him 4/5 or 0.8 of a wedge of cheese. Similarly, if Dean wants 20 cheese wedges for his personal consumption, which will take 5 hours to produce, his output of beer must fall to 15 kegs, because he only has 3 hours to brew beer. Thus, 4 extra wedges of cheese costs Dean 5 kegs of beer, meaning 1 extra wedge of cheese costs him 5/4 or 1.25 kegs of beer. What we have learned is that Dean and Randy, because they are different people with different skills and with different slopes to their production possibilities frontier, they each face different internal prices for goods based on their abilities. Okay, now that we've worked out that Dean and Randy have different relative prices for beer and for cheese, would it be mutually beneficial for them to trade? That is, would they voluntarily engage in trade? The answer is yes. To show this, let's say a trader were to insert himself into the picture. Could this trader essentially coerce, perhaps even unwittingly, Randy and Dean to trade with each other? Ah, the famous middleman. Well, that's a topic for another segment. For now, I want you to take away these key concepts. First, trade is a voluntary exchange between two parties. Second, a production possibilities frontier describes the limits of an individual's output if he spends all his available time producing one product versus another. Third, price reflects the cost of consuming one or more items at the expense of another. When talking about costs and prices, $1 is nothing more than an arbitrary reference point that is a societal norm. Hey Greg, you want to hear what perfect pitch sounds like?
That was great too.